Welcome to Strategikon.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. To our listeners, apologies for being off air for a while. Our producer Tim Whiffen had to pursue new work opportunities, leaving David and me without a producer for Strategikon. Nevertheless, in the intervening months, we have found a new producer, Michael Migali. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be here.
This interregnum gave David and me time to restructure the nature of our podcast. Rather than a podcast showcasing the talent of others, we've decided to take the bull by the horns and turn Strategikon into a showcase of Sage International's capabilities. What can we here in Adelaide and through our diffuse network of scholars and experts far removed from the world's trouble spots offer in terms of innovative solutions to today's complex tapestry of global political and social problems? Well, you're about to find out. So before we begin, I'd like to welcome back to Strategikon co-host David Olney. Welcome back, David. It's good to be back on air.
Welcome back, John, and welcome, Michael. And listeners, you may have heard Michael's voice before because he did an awful lot of student radio, and he is one of the best interviewers on international relations, paid or unpaid, who I have ever been interviewed with. By, I should say.
That's really great. And Michael, please feel free to join our conversations. Tim was an activist producer, and we would like you to continue in this tradition. Today's topic will be the Ukrainian crisis. Since the Russian surprise capture of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and Russia's active support of pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine in a region known as the Donbass, comprising the sub-regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, Ukraine has gone from relative obscurity to front-page news. The simmering Russian-backed war in eastern Ukraine, which began in 2014, catapulted to international infamy when in July 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by pro-Russian separatists operating a Russian-made Buk surface-to-air missile system, killing all 298 passengers and crew. Since then, the war in the east has cost 14,000 lives with no end in sight. Late last year, Russia mobilized 100,000 troops to the Ukrainian border. This action, as well as bellicose language from the Russian president regarding NATO pressing up against Russia's borders, has seen many speculating a Russian war against Ukraine could start in the first part of 2022. So, as we are in the first part of 2022, are we on the precipice of the first major European war since the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s? And if we are, what can we do to avoid it? David.
Well, first of all, I think I want to change the name from the Ukrainian crisis to the Russian opportunity. Because it seems to me that the majority of the media are getting what's going on wrong. And this is not about how desperately, or not desperately, Russia want control of a chunk of Ukraine. This is about Russia demonstrating its capacity to influence global affairs. It essentially has European fits. It has NATO pretending it will take action when in reality it showed no sign of knowing what to do. And it's an amazing way for Vladimir Putin to send a signal to China and the CCP in particular that, well, you've spent years trying to be very powerful, and guess what? You've hamstrung yourself. We've spent years under sanctions, and we can have all of you running around in circles thinking the sky is going to fall. So I think we've got to change the context of who we're talking about. Ukraine is just a pawn in the middle of much bigger things, and that's a very terrible place to be.
I think that is actually quite a good analysis of what is going on at the moment. However, you know, the one thing that I'm also looking at is what isn't being said. And I think that one of the key things that isn't being said at the moment, especially as far as the international media is concerned, I mean, after all the palaver they raised in terms of the so-called new axis for the 21st century between the Russians and the Chinese. Where are the Chinese in all of this? You would expect that in a situation of potential war, public statements supportive of the Russians coming from Beijing would be forthcoming, and they don't seem to be, unless of course the Western media isn't following what's going on in China.
No, there are no comments coming forward from the CCP that I can find. And we also have to remember that at the moment we've seen a fundamental shift in the relationship between China and Russia. China decided to punish Australia and stop buying as much of our coal. So at the moment, cities across northern China are missing electricity 10 to 12 hours a day, meaning that people probably will freeze to death in their apartments. As a consequence of this, the Chinese in desperation have reached out to the Russian regime and said, can we please have a second gas line? And thus far the response is, maybe. And it's now moved from maybe to we could do a pilot study. So China offered to build the new pipeline so it runs through all the countries where they have more influence. Russia's counteroffer is, no, we'll build the pipeline and we'll run it through every country where we want more influence. So fundamentally, if we look at what's going on at the moment, Vladimir Putin is making Europe dance in circles. He's potentially, within 6 months of now, going to start building a pipeline that will give him energy control over China the same way he has energy control over Europe. And he's doing all of this with a population of less than 170 million that is aging rapidly, being ravaged by COVID, that has been under economic sanctions for 6 years and can still disrupt every major power on earth.
So the real question here, and of course a lot of the public analysis seems to be also questioning this, is how far can Russia push this agenda for power by itself? And if what you're saying is true, David, I mean, you know, Putin's a clever, sly, cunning, fox-like individual on the international stage and can pull off swifties before you can know it. But Xi is also a cunning and clever man in his own right. Surely he sees the Russian freight train coming. I mean, by developing gas pipelines to the Russians, knowing that the Russians can turn off the spigot at any time and therefore have undue influence on Beijing, that can't be a welcome development as far as the CCP is concerned. They have a very inflated view of themselves. They think they're the ones calling the shots because they bring money to the table. And after all, as us capitalists all know, it's all about the money, right?
Yeah, that's the wonderful delusion, you could say, basically since the early 1970s with neoliberalism, that money can actually shape the future. What shapes the future is application of power or perceived power or being willing to push harder than anyone else. So if we look at it from an energy perspective, because that's a good thing to start breaking it down by, Venezuela, China worked real hard to get Venezuela under control, to get access to oil. Couldn't stabilise it. So the Russians sent in Wagner Group, and it's Wagner Group that stabilised Venezuela. So fundamentally, Venezuelan oil is only available to the Chinese if the Russians make it so. Iranian oil, well, how would you get it there? You need to have a pipeline running from Pakistan right through. Look at the protests in Pakistan against Chinese influence in the country. So all over the region, whether it's because of COVID, the collapse of the global production chain and distribution chain, 30 years of Chinese work to guarantee quiet control is unravelling before our eyes. And it's not to say it will entirely unravel, but the big difference between China and Russia is things can't get much worse in Russia. This ludicrous idea of the Americans that more sanctions will do anything. You've had them sanctioned almost to the point of oblivion since 2015. What's it done other than harden the regime? Michael, we've been talking here for a few minutes. Have you got a question you would like to add in?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Or a comment?
A couple of things. Well, firstly, I was interested in why Russia succeeded in Venezuela but China didn't. What did they do differently?
Russia understands that at the end of the day, if you're willing to use physical violence on other people, you can win. The only people China are willing to use physical violence on is their own population.
And the other thing, too, that we have to also remember is that Russia has had a history in Latin America by supporting liberation theology movements during the 1970s and left-leaning organizations.
And still with the connections to Cuba, even with the end of communism in Russia. In reality, there's still the links there. And at the end of the day, none of these places could probably survive without Russian weapons, a little bit of intelligence sharing, that makes such a difference.
And also, the Russians get on very well with the Cubans, in spite of the fact that the Cubans are trying to sort of normalize its relations with the United States, and that's not.
Yeah, but Russia would like normalized relationships too.
Well, not really. They want to be in the controller's seat. If they really wanted normalized relationships with the rest of the international community, they had that opportunity, but they kind of blew it, because it's like, well, we don't trust you, we don't like you, and so therefore we're going to just do what we like to do, even if it really, really bothers you. You know, and that's the truth of the matter, right?
But Russia has a history of, if it doesn't push, it's attacked.
Yeah,
so it's so deep.
That's a strategic culture perception that they have, and look, it's based on history. I don't take that away at all. I mean, Russia suffered.
Yeah, but Putin is not going to jump out of that being an ex-KGB colonel.
That is
and
true.
And the more that the regime is young dudes becoming middle-aged dudes who went through the Chechen war or were involved in the Georgian war, or just think now, even the Dirty Tricks Brigade, the little green men from 2014, 2015, they're now in their 30s or maybe even in their early 40s. So what we have is an entire elite that understand we have to push, we have to destabilise. They don't have power to do things, they have power to destabilise things.
Yeah.
And to take it the step further, we have to remember too that, you know, Russian officers in their military since very late 90s, early 2000s have been trained in the doctrine that it is legitimate to use tactical nukes on the battlefield. So they fundamentally understand war differently now to NATO, and we don't know to what extent whether it's different to the PLA. So fundamentally, if they go into Ukraine and take half of Ukraine, they could legitimately pull the tactical nuke threat because they've practiced for it. Now that is a radically different game than we understand. It's not the game we've played. We've played counterinsurgency and counterterrorism in the Middle East, and that is not the game the Russians have been playing or planning for.
It's interesting. I mean, for much of the international prognostications about what a future war between Russia and Ukraine will look like, very few people have mentioned, you know, Russia's nuclear card. Russia's nuclear card is the reality no one wants to speak of, because partly I don't think that the West has a good answer to it.
No, we haven't done any preparation to deal with that potential consequence.
No.
So what we have, again, if we want to lay out, you know, ideally for Russia to invade Ukraine, it needs to be the depths of winter so that heavy armour doesn't sink.
Yep.
So in reality, the next month is the best time to go while everything's frozen. Before now would have been pointless because it's slushy. Who wants heavy armour and slush? That's just not groovy.
Pulling tanks out of that kind of stuff is not a good thing.
So imagine that at some point in the next 4 weeks, all the armadas that have been built, all the upgraded armour, roll across, supported by little green men, you know, advanced Sukhois and MiGs above it, a cyber capacity that takes out all Ukrainian communications, banking, you know, turns off the power plant, turns off the water plant, turns off the sewage plant, all in the first 5 to 6 hours of the war. In a week, half of Ukraine is gone.
You know, that's interesting. I got into a bit of a debate with a colleague of mine with regard to all of this, and, you know, he said that you have to understand, John, but generally speaking, when a country tries to prepare to go to war, they try to get at least a 3-to-1 advantage of troops over and above their enemy, right? And this is a rule of thumb, a standard rule of thumb. It's been with us for a long time. You really do have to have a majority of forces that can overwhelm your opponent. Now, in the Russian case, as far as we know, they have just over 100,000 in place. But that's about the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, which means that they don't have a numerical edge. So
but they do, because they have 100,000 people ready to take action, as opposed to 100,000 as a total military, where at least half of that 100,000 in the Ukrainian military are in no state to fight anybody. They're support staff.
Yeah, and there's also the quality of the training. Some people say that the Ukrainian military has, you know, improved significantly since 2014, and I think that's
probably true.
Pockets of it have. No doubt, the new influx of Western weapons coming into the Ukrainian army will benefit the Ukrainians if they wish to ambush Russian armored columns as they come through. that will be a good thing for them to do because it's light and it's uncomplicated. But again, they really need to be very well trained in the use of these anti-tank missiles in order for them to get the maximum advantage. Do the Ukrainians actually have that capacity? Because really that's going to determine whether or not the Russians will be deterred from going in and capturing at least half of Ukraine, right?
Well, I think an important way to view this is the big lesson for all the former Soviet Union is all their military history and training, which is the experience of defence in depth from World War II. So the reality is the Ukrainian front line can't be astounding because the planning has to be for defence in depth.
Yep.
So at what point are they actually willing to fall back to? And I would imagine that the fallback point is somewhere about halfway across, where you separate essentially from European Ukraine to Eastern Ukraine. Because fundamentally there's a proportion of Eastern Ukraine that doesn't want to be Ukrainian. It wants to be funded by the Putin kleptocratic state. It wants money to just roll as a slush fund. It hasn't liked this democracy thing. It hasn't done well. Life is hard. Life will get hard under Putin soon too, because he's running out of money and resources. But in reality, in the short term, there'll be a cash spree like there was after 2014, 2015. So fundamentally, if half of Ukraine falls in the first week because the Ukrainians have to fight in a defence-in-depth posture that can't actually work because they just don't have the resources, NATO will and ah, the Poles will want to be let off the leash. But everyone who's got a cool head will realise if the Poles get let off the leash, how do we then stop what happens next?
Well,
NATO can't intervene.
That would signify the breakdown of NATO if the Poles do go off the leash.
Precisely.
Which leads me then to the next thing. I mean, Warsaw's government is pretty hardlined. It's certainly very anti-Russian. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about the current government or the opposition. They just don't want to see Russian jackboots walking down the streets of Warsaw anymore. And they're armed to the teeth. Now, being part of NATO means that they're all part of the NATO trigger. But is there a chance that they see Ukraine in a way that other Europeans don't see it?
Yes.
And it's an existential threat to them because, it's a very real prospect that if the Russian soldiers end up in Kiev, they're going to end up in Warsaw at some point in the not too distant future, or at least they'll run into Lithuania or one of the smaller Baltic states, which will again really do damage to NATO's NATO's eastern flank.
Well, here's a hypothesis. Russia push hard enough to make the Poles mobilise, and the minute the Poles roll into Ukraine, the Russians go ceasefire at this point, we keep the east, you keep the west, we don't have two major armies, crush the rest. So the ultimate typical Putin gamble of pushing to the absolute limits, where the cost is low and the gains are huge. What does he gain out of all of this? He gains the eastern half of Ukraine, he locks in his warm water ports, he locks in control of all the oil and gas pipelines and all the train lines running from China to Europe. He shows that NATO is not cohesive. At that point, Poland probably has shown that NATO won't work together. So from a Western perspective, he destabilises NATO, destabilises the EU, and gets ground. From an Eastern perspective, let's go look at the last time the Russians and China did massive exercises, 2019. If the information out there to be read by civilians can be believed, the Russians wiped the floor with the PLA in every exercise, annihilated them. So if things are getting worse between Russia and China as frenemies, Ukraine is the ultimate opportunity to blood all the new technology, the new generation of professional military, to establish the myth of invincibility that Putin needs to keep his regime upright. NATO's fractured. Poland sees it's out on its own and starts wondering, well, what's the point of the EU? This is every advantage Putin could get in one big gamble.
We're making one massive assumption here, though, David. Unfortunately, we're talking about war as if it's an inevitability, but what we're not doing is we're not looking at the ongoing negotiations to defuse the crisis. I mean, Lavrov and Blinken, they're sitting down, they're chatting, they're having phone talks, they're doing virtual meetings. They're trying to keep the George war process from turning into a war process. I mean, and then there's the narrative of Western weakness, which, of course, both the Chinese and the Russians have been putting out into the social media and putting out, well, I mean, basically it's a thing that, they stand by. It's a narrative they truly believe. The West is corrupt, the West is weak, the West is divided. And we're going to demonstrate that right now. And, of course, when we look at how the West has responded up to now, it does look pretty lame. It looks pretty lame. Brussels hasn't got a plan really, except for sending some Javelin missiles across, I should say. We're not talking about major bits of equipment like, F-16 fighters going off to Kiev and training up an air force. I mean, the one real weakness in the entire Ukrainian order of battle is that their fixed-wing aircraft are pretty old and tatty in comparison to what the Russians can field. Everyone knows you don't have air superiority over the battlefield, you lose.
But let's take weakness from the other side. If the Russians do this, it's a one-shot deal. They've used their best armour, their best aircraft, their best people. They've left the east essentially then unsecured because they'll potentially lose a proportion of the best. They've played their one-trick pony thing for the last time. So, if they do it, it's a one-shot deal that then makes them far weaker after they've done it than they were before it. So the irony of this is if Putin does it, it's a one-trick, activity. He can do this once, he can do it for a couple of weeks, he can seize half the country, hopefully get everything he wants, but then what state is everything in? How much of the available resources has he used up? So in the same way that we can't imagine NATO being effective in response, can we really imagine Putin risking his great advantage, which is the threat to do this again?
Well, that then raises this issue that's come out of the UK recently with regard to the idea that the Russians want to sponsor a coup in Kiev and install a pro-Russian puppet government. Now, the whole idea doesn't reek of being impossible to pull off.
Well, it's old school Soviet politics. It's nothing new.
It is indeed. And of course, the best thing that can come out of that, I mean, rather than the Russians getting potentially bogged down in an insurgency over parts of eastern Ukraine, they'd want to keep their best and brightest basically alive for other contingencies. So, if you were to then seize the capital, Kiev, install a puppet government, that would split the Ukrainian armed forces, and then the Ukrainians would turn on themselves because, the government of the day, look, the Ukrainians themselves as a people are highly patriotic, those that aren't under the Russian yoke, or influence, I should say, in the East. But those other Ukrainians are very patriotic, and I'm sure they'd pick up an AK-47 and start shooting a Russian
So
if it were a case of that person posing a threat, a clear present threat.
So the long-term misery this potentially causes. But this is the point. If Russia wants to do it, they can win in that first week. But what's it like after that first week? So we're back to the whole thing of modern war. Can you win decisively on the battlefield?
I think that the idea of a coup being staged and a puppet government coming in makes it very likely that the Russians could win all of Ukraine, not just a part of it. And the reason why I say that is that if the Ukrainians are fighting Ukrainians and no one trusts each other in Kiev, then obviously all the pro-Russian government would have to do is raise its hand and say, we need some peacekeepers, and then that government would invite the Russians in and the Belarusians in as peacekeepers to keep the peace. And so therefore there is no war to be fought. It is basically protecting the puppet government that the Russians have installed.
But
it's a very cost-effective way of actually seizing the country effectively.
And let's look at this time frame-wise. If the ground is hard now, if you want to actually invade, it's hard for about another 5 to 6 weeks.
Yep.
Which means it either rolls in the next 5 or 6 or it doesn't roll.
Yeah.
Which means the most likely thing, it's not going to roll. And then the strategy moves on to all these other things of destabilization. And to just make it that the Ukrainians get tired and just so much internal dissent. So at the end of the day, Russia gets what it wants anyway. It proves that it's got the power to destabilize and transform the global order, to show the West how weak it is, to make sure that the CCP never underestimates it. So either way here, it seems to me, Russia, unless we wake up, and wake up monumentally, wins. So it seems to me the only important question left is Russia can win either way. They could win militarily, but they probably won't do it, because after you win militarily, the costs are too high, and you're not then ready for whatever happens next militarily. Or they keep this on the knife edge for another 6 weeks, start wearing everyone's interest out. The news media get bored, and that gives them more and more time to work on subverting what is already a very shaky, political system, because it's never had a chance to stabilise and become a modern, calm system. So, hypothetically, if what we're saying here is Putin can win on the battlefield, or he can win through dirty tricks, how do we stop him from wanting to win? That becomes the only important question. Or how do we buy him off? And I say buy off very deliberately, because I think the best thing at this point is actually to offer an amazing package of normalising relations between Russia and the EU and NATO, and saying that, yep, no more countries will join NATO, the EU won't get any bigger, but you stop freaking out towards the West and you pay more attention to the East.
Oh, gee, David, that's a big call. I don't know whether or not anyone would be
Well, no one's
wanting to
got
do
the
that.
stones.
No one's got the stones for that kind of stuff. That
But-
would be... Well, and then there are those true believers in the idea of the West and democracy who'd say, there is no effing way that we're going to be sitting down negotiating the security of Eastern and Central Europe with the Russians under its current leadership, because we know that if you give him the finger, he will take the hand. You give him the hand, he will take the arm.
Yep.
That whole salami slicing tactic is as old as the dirty tricks that the Russians have been pulling off to become a superpower, for crying out loud.
Putin is running tricks from the 1960s and 1970s in Latin America and in Africa. The decades where the Soviets were running rings around the United States. So the Soviets know how to win, the Americans know how to lose. What's changed?
Yeah. And look, there's part of me that says, okay, so the Soviets have modernized and reformed their armed forces to undertake a whole heap of hybrid warfare actions. And you'd have to wonder, well, okay, if that's the case, what, how good will they be? What makes them more special than, say, US forces doing something dastardly in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan, for instance? We've got that recent history, that Western template of interfering in another country to look at. But, people
But
are
let's go
people,
back a bit
governments are
further.
government, governments are government, David. And the fact is, are we actually going to have a more capable Russia in comparison to what we consider a less capable United States?
But let's look back at a comparative operation. Why look at what the West did? Why not look at Chechnya and Georgia? Chechnya, they bombed the capital city into oblivion.
Yeah.
So the capacity for violence, for brutality, and for, quote-unquote, a variation of a final solution, i.e. just eliminate the city, that's still on the Russian cards. Putin signed off on it.
No.
Georgia, the Georgian military collapsed in days.
Yeah.
So we're not dealing with the same thing. We're not dealing with the West going into somewhere that is the other side of the world and only matters for access to energy. We're dealing with a place that is part of the myth of what makes Russia Russia, that Russia can legitimately frame as an existential threat. In a way, the West had to work incredibly hard to frame terrorism as an existential threat. We're also dealing with a population who the national myth is still about military prowess. Look at the contrast, I think it was the Rubin report did, between adverts to join the Russian military and the US military last year. The Russian military is some young dude who looks mega chiseled out in the Arctic 3 days in a foxhole waiting to take a shot in the ice.
Yep.
In the US, it's a rainbow-haired coloured young woman telling her two mums she's going to join the army. This says an awful lot about the societies in which militaries function. And the societies that function differently are going to perceive the use of violence differently and the use of threat. Russia does threat well. The West doesn't do threat well because it doesn't know how to follow through in a way that gets results.
Well, we have to then go and see how that German admiral who came out recently and said that, Vladimir Putin just wants respect. Why don't we just give him respect? And I sat back and I thought to myself, what an ill-disciplined dork that guy happened to have
not being
been.
rude, it's the German Navy.
But it's not only the German Navy. You have to ask the question here: how deep are these sentiments running throughout the entire German establishment, including the Bundeswehr and all the other aspects of the intelligence services?
To what extent did the military reflect the society
Right.
as absorbing an anti-war? Everything
Right.
can be reasoned out. And this is, okay, key concept at the bottom of all of this seems to me is the Russian political and military establishment still understand the utility of violence and can make peace with it. The Western political elite cannot understand the use of violence anymore if it's going to threaten their career.
Well, let's put it this way. And I know this is a terrible thing, and I think that we must have said this at some point in our podcasting history. The loss of a life is a tragedy, without a doubt. But is it that much of a tragedy that it prevents a politician from giving the order to commit violence in the name that the collective, your society, can be defended? Because that's what war is all about, right? It's not about, some pink-haired dude sitting at the console pressing a button and letting the drones go off and do the fighting. Because eventually, you will be overwhelmed, your position will be captured, and bad things will happen to you if you're not prepared to get your hands dirty, grab a knife, grab a gun, and blow someone's head off. Now, if that's not your bag, you shouldn't be wearing a uniform. I mean, ultimately. And this comes back to all these old arguments that I remember from the 1990s as the Australian military was transforming itself into a much more liberal institution and less hardened in its capacities, And look, there are good points and bad points to a lot of these things. I don't want to make a big deal about it, but in terms of actually fighting a shooting war, you have to question its logic. Okay, so we've got women frontline soldiers. We allow the woke brigade to seize, the higher command structure. Arguably, Germany is quintessential in that. So we've got all these very woke, politically correct people who don't like war sitting there worrying about what to do with Russia without the capacity to do anything. Now, the
or
Germans...
to understand the old game that the Russians still see the utility of violence.
So really, Russia does have an advantage in that sense, over and above the West, because they're prepared to die and kill in numbers in order to protect the national interest or to project the national interest. We're not prepared.
Project.
We're not prepared to sacrifice one of our soldiers, not one. And that puts us at a disadvantage. And these woke people don't understand the nature of war because they think war is abhorrent. We'll automate all our functions.
Let's change it to the nature of politics, because really all war is an extension of politics. They don't understand the nature of politics, and that is to get the outcome you prefer. There is a very high cost. And what we need to be dealing with here is not is Ukraine going to be invaded? Isn't Ukraine going to be invaded? We need to understand there's a different underlying ethos between a Russian regime that understands the utility of violence and the power of destabilization, have been experts at it literally since the 1940s, and excluding Afghanistan, have had an incredible record of success of destabilizing and using the utility of violence to their advantage. On the other hand, we had the superpower that probably wasn't ready to become a superpower, wasn't sure it even wanted to be one or what to do with it, despite the Monroe Doctrine, as the United States, that used to understand the utility of violence, but less and less is aware of, it still has utility, but trying to work with NATO and the EU, who, because of the consequences of World War II, want to argue there is no utility to violence, and terrible destabilising dirty tricks, well, that's just not nice. Well, big deal. Of course it's not nice. But while you've got one side who are still willing to work with the utility of violence and the power of destabilisation, that is the world in which you have to function. And can't we have a decent discussion about the fact that is what we're dealing with, and what we need to do is to work out what to say or do to get a regime that understands the utility of violence and the power of destabilisation to step back from the brink, which means they're going to have to win a prize or recognise the cost is too high. They're the only options. Sanctions are not a cost that's too high because they've suffered them now for 6 years. Big deal. What are we going to do that makes the cost too high, or what are we willing to give away to Russia? To me, they're the only two things worth talking about.
That reminds me of another thing that I saw on the BBC, and that was the thing that perplexed me when I had my senior moment earlier, and that was sanctions. So we've had a number of sanctions placed on Russia, and they have had its effect on the Russian economy. But there had been a number of people who came out and publicly said, well, look, obviously if the Russians do anything too dramatic, we're going to have to increase the sanctions regime. And the journalist in question then said, well, why don't you just increase the sanctions regime now? Said, well,
Blinken nearly fell over himself trying to find an answer.
Well, basically the answer was, well, we can't actually give the game away right now. We can't, put the sanctions on the people in question now because that would diminish its deterrent value. And so that leads us then to the next lot of thinking that we should do about this crisis, and that is, what do we do, and by we I mean the West, what do we do to preserve the contemporary order and to deter the Russians from taking drastic measures? I mean, converting their 100,000 into an invasion force. I mean, at the moment, they're convincing us, or at least trying to convince us, nothing to see here. We're just doing exercise. Exercise good. We need to keep soldiers strong. Okay, fine. But if that then turns into an invasion force, what can NATO do? And what do the political capitals in the European context do to try to prevent Vladimir from turning this force into an invasion force?
Well, not what can they do, what will they do?
Well,
because the problem is at the moment, we think we understand what Russia will do, even though there's a very good chance they won't invade.
Well, that's
I actually think for every week this goes on, the window disappears.
Yeah.
But they've still proven their point. We can keep the world wrapped around our finger for months at a time.
Yep.
We can totally destabilise Ukraine to the point where it's easier to take control of it. We can make Poland in particular get more and more angry and see red and have steam come out its ears, thus upsetting the balance of NATO. We can make Europe look weak, and we can constantly remind China, we're frenemies, don't forget the second half of that word.
So basically, they've kind of already won.
They've played the game brilliantly as ever, and the West has played the game poorly as ever, and the media has done its typical useless job of presenting the media in exactly the way that suits the Russian regime. Well done, democratic media. Fourth estate, go team.
Yeah, who would have ever thought the democratic media would actually be an echo chamber for totalitarianism? But it does.
Does a great job of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what will the West do to change this? And it either has to be a credible threat or accept that we just need to suck it up and give Russia some sort of win to reduce tensions, make some promises about NATO stays the size it is, Ukraine is independent but won't be a part of EU or NATO. Somehow we've got to give something away. Because at the end of the day, as long as Putin is essentially thinking, much like the Germans for their history, of always having to be prepared for two fronts, he can't ever take the pressure off. Because there's no other choice. His only way forward from... And why would he change his policies now when the policies he's using work so brilliantly? This idea, let Putin behave differently. Why? What he does works. Why would he change his game? China.
Hang on, David. Are you giving Vladimir Putin respect?
Yes.
Damn.
For being an incredible tactician and strategist who, despite all the odds, has maintained power and continued to be a force for whatever he wants in the world.
I'm just wondering whether or not, if we actually had competent leadership in the West, whether we would look at Vladimir in a different light. If we had our own version of Vladimir Putin, a democratic one, say, for instance, right? So he got elected or was put into the bureaucracy of some democratic country, did not pose a threat to the internal workings of that country, and yet, could just give the various orders and analyses and whatnot to ensure that the West's interests are defended in a clever way. Would we look at Vladimir Putin differently?
I'd say yes. So let's look at the end of World War II, when the Allies roll around Europe, grabbing German rocket scientists, radar scientists, and cryptography people, grabbing all the brains. So it doesn't matter if your enemy is your enemy. What matters is your enemy has skills you value. And in reality, Putin's a bloody good operator and has surrounded himself with people who can't be fools. because the game keeps working despite the economic trepidations, despite COVID hammering Russia from everything we can see from the outside, despite gradual demographic decline.
And also despite the fact that Vladimir Putin's own internal polling is not looking so great in Russia.
No.
I mean, there was a time where you could almost guarantee that every time he goes to the polls, he'll get a 60% slice voting for him. And, you wouldn't necessarily question that 60%. You'd say, yeah, okay, look, there's voter fraud and, ballot box
But he's still
stuffing.
got a majority.
But he's got a majority. He's got a
majority.
working majority. And in many ways, you could consider that the legitimate expression of the Russian people. That does not exist today. There are people suggesting that, his support is tanked internally. He's only at about 20% at best. And if that's the case, in spite of that, a craptacular economy, which is about the size of Spain, in spite of Russia's military reach, and in spite of all the other things, like you say, the COVID, struggling with COVID and all that kind of stuff, they seem to keep themselves upright. And to me, it shows. And again, I think that this is really where the narrative changes back to the West. It shows that the lack of leadership, the lack of political direction, and the lack of strength that the West exudes really allows Putin to play a weak hand extraordinarily well. Right?
Yeah.
Now, if we were to harden up, that would that would change the calculus in Moscow entirely. Why the hell have we not hardened up? I mean, we see these politicians with their mealy-mouthed statements telling us all about, we are superior, we're this, we're that, everyone loves us, and we're everything to everybody. We are the color of the rainbow, effectively. Everyone's got rights, everyone's got this, everyone's got that. But when push comes to shove, and when naked power becomes the thing that you really need to focus on, we just don't have, well, to use David's term, the stones necessary to protect. Now, if you can't protect it, then of course
you won't keep it.
You won't keep it. Exactly right.
And see, Putin's relying on the oldest trick in the Russian handbook, and that is internal division, always a problem in Russia, right until the point where you can legitimize a threat to everyone.
Yep.
So what choice does he have? So in a sense, if the West could use a combination of carrot and stick and say, go any further, bad things happen. But we'll give you a prize. Now, actually, giving Putin some degree of peace with the level of instability potentially within Russia in the population, the lack of support for the regime is relying on an existential threat mentality to keep Russians on board. If the existential threat goes down, how much harder would it make for him to maintain power? So it's in our interest to give the Russian population breathing room so they can get angry.
I think you're right, actually. I think that in that sense, the more we sit down and look at Putin's externals, the very Achilles heel that he presents to the world quite openly in many ways is the one thing that we're not going for.
Yep.
And that could be because subconsciously we do fear him falling over and chaos reigning supreme throughout that gigantic landmass of the Russian Federation.
Yep.
I mean, if, for instance, Putin were given the dodgy prawn and there's no proper succession in place, what sort of chaotic mess would that turn into for Europe, and how will that affect European stability, for instance? So the question then has to be asked, is it in our interest to see the end of Putin, or is it in our interest to control Putin? Now, if it's about controlling Putin, we've certainly failed that.
Or even
big time.
accommodating. How about we put the word, let's find an accommodation where Russia looks after its own future but stops being a pain on its western border. Because if the regime
turn them against the Chinese, you mean?
Well, make it so they look east more often than they look west.
Yeah.
We got to remember that the Russian court for centuries spoke French. They fundamentally want to be
They're
more
European.
connected to the west than they want to be connected to the east. Population-wise, industrial output-wise, the east is frightening for them. As long as they've got energy, they've got control for a while. But to go back, laying out in the beginning of this episode, militarily, can Russia do it? Absolutely. They can win in a week. And then what? They've played the military card once. They then probably have to play the tactical nuke card. Maybe everything calms down. But after that, where do they go? The great advantage with this card that Vladimir Putin is playing is no one knows how it ends, But what he does know is the West has no longer got the ability to be decisive, and the West no longer understands the utility of violence or the ability to make a threat and follow through.
Well, here's a scenario for you. And that is that Putin successfully manages to capture half of Ukraine. Let's be optimistic. He's not going to go
Yep.
for the whole thing.
No.
There's not going to be a military coup in Kiev, but there's going to be a quick, short, sharp military exchange. Half of the territory of Ukraine, the eastern half, goes to the Russians. The Russians put a protective tactical nuclear umbrella over that area, preventing anyone from escalating beyond which...
And do a people swap.
Yep.
Anyone from the West who wants to come east or east go west.
Right.
You literally do it like the partition in India.
Yeah.
And simply say, you be in the half you want to live in, therefore he gets a population who want to be part of the greater Russian Empire. Western Ukraine becomes more European. He still demonstrates immense power. He probably hasn't used up all of his capacity. But again, he still demonstrated one more time the utility of violence and threat.
Well, if we look at it from that perspective, the other thing that comes from looking a little bit more medium term, if the Russians were to take the eastern part of Ukraine, that leaves the western part of Ukraine to then make its decision to join NATO. And I would imagine that the invitation would be dangling in front of them by Brussels, because I think that would mean Ukraine has suffered enough. It's now a rump state in comparison to what it was. What was it, the second largest country in Europe at the moment? So from a geographic perspective, it's sliced down the middle. Ukraine becomes, or the western part becomes, a
Western
frontline
Ukraine,
state.
yeah.
Western Ukraine then becomes a frontline state, and so therefore joins NATO. That then will put added pressure on the Russians, and then you end up having a traditional
We go back to
arms
normal
race.
Cold War, which we all understand and did for decades.
Right.
Knowing there's no more pushing without nuclear war.
Correct.
But, once again, Russia got more than it should have. It provided existential threat, national interest that brought the Russian people together behind Putin at a period where his numbers are terrible.
Yep.
It allowed more time for regime succession. It allowed the Russians to show the Chinese never forget we're frenemies. It allowed more time to gain control of energy supplies to both East and West. So imagine your Russian long-term planners, and you're going, at some point, between solar, wind, solar, thermal, pumped hydro, all these other things in the world, eventually natural gas isn't going to be a great advantage.
Yeah.
So what that means is you've got to exploit that advantage for as long as you can, as well as you can, which means being able to play Europe and China off of each other for who is your best customer for as long as the gas lasts is the best possible solution. So we either interrupt Putin's excellent game by genuinely saying, here is a red line, but we are going to give you a prize. Because the best prize we can give Putin is something that looks like peace, so the Russian people can legitimately ferment.
Which really wouldn't be in Putin's interest, so he'll be looking for another crisis.
But we need to
divert.
understand that's the game.
Yeah.
The game is always the next act of destabilisation, which we will then turn into a 3-month hand-wringing media fest, rather than any decisive decisions, any decisive action, any statement of, here is the red line. Cross red line, these things happen.
I was just thinking about that scenario with Ukraine. If Putin were to actually take half of that country, or even install a puppet government, and we go to that scenario that I put forward
I'd
earlier.
rather the half, because I think the puppet government thing is just too messy for everyone.
I think you're right, but I mean, in the world of strategy, you've got to take as many of these scenarios down as possible. If they were to work if this was going to be successful, it becomes a working template for other areas around the Russian periphery, and I'm talking maybe Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, other areas of instability and/or natural mineral interest for the Russians, that they could actually start using this model, this Ukrainian model, in which they could then capture further territory and actually consolidate Russian power in that sort of Eurasian space.
Well, what's the point of the second pipeline to China running through different places other than exactly that? So a second pipeline to China will be the beginning of a much stronger Russian influence across Central Asia. Thus then providing a reason to put in good highways, good infrastructures, so when it's time to start mining all the interesting minerals in Central Asia, it will be just so much easier for these countries to deal with a Russian company, even if the ore goes to China for processing.
I think that would always be the case because of those cultural
Precisely.
Soviet...
The 50 years of leftover people.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, everyone, that's a wrap. My thanks to co-host David Olney and Strategicon producer Michael Migali for being with us today, and our thanks to the Ozcast Network. To our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you will join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategicon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify, and please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategicon Raw YouTube channel when they're available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni. You've been listening to Strategicon, a Sage International podcast.